Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming out on what turns out to be a balmy February day to the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium for History is Lunch. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. If you have not already, please silence your cell phones. Remember, our two new special exhibits have opened upstairs, Spirits of the Passage, which tells the story of the transatlantic slave trade, and the Slave series, Quilts by Gwendolyn McGee, on loan from the Mississippi Museum of Art. Those are both fabulous. We also have options for your Thursday evening. Tomorrow at the Eudora Welty House and Garden, there will be a great free program for anyone interested in Welty, although it is aimed initially at educators. From 4:30 to 6:30 p.m., hear contributors to the new University Press of Mississippi book, Teaching the Works of Eudora Welty, 21st Century Approaches, including Suzanne Mars, Carolyn Brown, Leanne Bryan, Ebony Lumumba, Pearl McCaney, and others. That's free at the Welty House tomorrow evening. And then tomorrow as well, the 31st Annual Governor's Arts Awards ceremony will be held at the Old Capitol. You're invited to a public reception there at 4:30, as well as the program itself at 6. Those awards are presented in partnership between the Mississippi Arts Council and the Governor's Office. Some of this year's recipients include the Canton Spirituals, New Stage Theater, and Hartley and Mary Peavy. Finally, I hope that you will join us here next week for History's Lunch, when our speaker will be Kevin Green from the University of Southern Mississippi, discussing his new book on the bluesman Big Bill Broonzy. I had always heard that Big Bill Broonzy was from Mississippi. I find out in reading Kevin's book that he claimed to be from Shaw, Mississippi, but may not have been. So let me apologize in advance if there's not as strong a Mississippi history connection as I had always assumed. It will be a great program. Today, we are delighted to have with us Ben Wynne to discuss his book, The Man Who Punched Jefferson Davis, The Political Life of Henry S. Foote, Southern Unionist. Ben Wynne is professor of history at the University of North Georgia. He earned his undergraduate degree at Millsaps College, his master's degree in history at Mississippi College, and his doctorate in history from the University of Mississippi. Wynne's other books include In Tune, Charlie Patton, Jimmie Rodgers, and the Roots of American Music, Mississippi's Civil War, A Narrative History, and A Hard Trip, A History of the 15th Mississippi Infantry CSA. Help me welcome Ben Wynne.
Thanks. All right, I appreciate all of y'all being here today. Especially I've got a bunch of fraternity brothers in the audience, so they don't believe anything they tell you. Anyway, before I start, I'm going to read a very short passage out of the book. I like to establish my credentials early on that I can read. So I'm going to read this to you. On Christmas morning, 1847, 6 very important men assembled in one of the public rooms of a large boarding house in Washington, D.C., ostensibly for casual after-breakfast conversation. In the parlance of the era, it was a, quote, mixed group of 4 Southerners and 2 Northerners. 2 of the men were United States senators, the other 4 were members of the House of Representatives. And because of the climate of the times, they all had much to discuss. The end of the Mexican War was close at hand, and the future of slavery in vast western territories hung in the balance. As they sat and talked, the men haphazardly raised a number of sectional issues, including the merits of popular sovereignty and the extension of the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific Ocean as potential remedies for the slavery, quote, problem. Though the holiday atmosphere lent itself to informality, their political banter grew heated. Within minutes, 2 of the men came to physical blows, their colleagues finally pulling them apart as they rolled around on the floor like a pair of angry schoolboys. Despite the topics under discussion, sectionalism had little to do with the encounter. The fight was merely the physical manifestation of an already strained relationship between 2 politicians who should have had much in common. The combatants were Mississippi's Democratic senators Henry Stuart Foote and Jefferson Davis. Foote resented Davis for his natural aloofness, while the future president of the Confederacy bristled at the venomous personal jabs that more often than not punctuated his fellow Mississippians' political rhetoric. For Davis, the encounter was a rare loss of self-control, a brief but intense drop of his guard. In short, it was a rare emotional display of barbarism from a man who was accustomed to public formality. For Henry Foote, the fight was business as usual. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about Henry Foote, the subject of the book here. He was, in my opinion, the most colorful antebellum political figure in the country that nobody's ever heard of. He was at his peak as a politician when he served as a U.S. Senator from Mississippi, 1847 to 1851, and right after that as governor. But he also was very well traveled. He did a lot of things. He ended up being a Confederate congressman from Tennessee. He also affected politics in Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, and even California. So he was all over the place, and he was one of these guys that had sort of had 9 lives, politically speaking, and could remake himself. And he needed every one of those lives. Foote had 2 claims to fame, or lasting legacies, however you want to put it. First of all, he was probably the South's most outspoken Unionist in the decade before the Civil War. He was leader of the pack there in the South that didn't want to secede, which that went sideways with a lot of the mainstream members of the Democratic Party in the South during that period. And it really, what he's known for is right around 1850, the sectional issues dealing with slavery, they were coming to a head, and there was a lot of arguing going on, and a lot of people call that the first secession crisis in 1850. And as many of you probably know, they've come up with a compromise. It's called the Compromise of 1850. It basically, most people think it put the Civil War off for a decade. And so Foote was heavily involved in all of that. And he was one of the only Southerners who wanted to compromise with the Northerners. A lot of the Southern politicians, even in 1850, they didn't want to compromise on the slavery issue or any other issue. They didn't trust a lot of the Northern politicians. And Foote sort of positioned himself as a pro-Union guy, and he backed compromise with the North in 1850 when it was not politically expedient to do that. He suffered politically. In fact, he lost his Senate seat because of it. But he stuck to his guns and remained in kind of that pro-Union position for the whole decade of the 1850s. And then, of course, right at the end, he flips so he can get elected to the Confederate Congress. But for a long time, he was one of the loudest voices in the South arguing against secession. So that made him pretty well known. His other claim to fame is his hatred for Jefferson Davis. Probably Jefferson Davis's most vocal and venomous political enemy. He hated the hatred between those 2 guys. If you want to talk about famous political hatreds, you can go Andrew Jackson, John C. Calhoun. You can go Lyndon Johnson, Bobby Kennedy. Well, this hatred is right up in that class. I came across him, Foote, back in the dark ages when I was doing my doctoral dissertation. And his name kept popping up. I was doing my dissertation on the Unionists in the South before the Civil War, and his name kept popping up. And the more I would read about him, the more interesting he became to me. He sort of had dual personalities. On one hand, he was sort of a genius, and a lot of people believed he was a genius. He was able to get elected to several public offices when it wasn't really, nobody expected him to. And he was also a very sociable guy. He was great at dinner parties. He quoted Latin and Greek philosophers. I mean, he was a really smart guy. And then on the other hand, he was this raving lunatic when he was out campaigning. He was a tireless campaigner and writer, letters to the newspapers and all kinds of things. I mean, he had just great energy with all of that. And he would provoke his debating partners to physical violence. He knew how to push people's buttons. He was a very sarcastic guy. And a lot of people were drawn to his rallies just to see what was going to happen. because you never knew. It was going to be really entertaining, and the fight might break out. And he had a huge ego, and when he was in the Senate, where there is a certain amount of decorum, he broke decorum all the time. He would call anybody that he didn't like, any name in the book, and he got involved in all kinds of altercations, some on the floor of the U.S. Senate. And so he was just kind of a wild guy. And that ended up being his downfall, because he would burn bridges as he got into arguments with people. He got into arguments, and the arguments were so bad that they were unforgivable. And so, again, that works against him. He's one of these guys that he liked winning the battle, but at the expense of winning the war. He was short term, he was really good, but he didn't long term. He liked to chase, but once he got in office, a lot of times didn't know what to do with it. And so I was reading about all of that, and I thought, well, this guy's pretty interesting. Then come to find out, during his lifetime, he was involved in 5 duels with other lawyers or politicians, 7 fistfights with other politicians, including Davis, pulled a gun on a fellow senator on the floor of the U.S. Senate, pulled a knife on another one on the floor of the U.S. Senate. So, how could you not want to write about that guy, So, anyway, let's see if this works here. There we go. Got a couple of pictures of Foote. This one on the left, he's got his hairpiece on. A lot of people made fun of his hairpiece there. That was taken around the time he was in the U.S. Senate. That other one was taken around the time he entered the Confederate Congress. This is a picture when he was older, obviously. And that's the portrait of Foote that's hanging over in the new Capitol building there with all the other governors. Again, Foote, a great public speaker, fantastic public speaker who used sarcasm and would directly insult people. He would be on social media all the time. If he were the Twitter, tweeting, all that stuff, he would be doing all of that. Generated great controversy wherever he went, never backed down, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that he is wrong. He would never admit it. And he once told his friend Reuben Davis, who was another politician from Mississippi, that this was kind of his political creed. And he was half joking. He was joking, but only half joking. He said, "Ignorance and impudence will succeed far better than intellect and modesty." So that ends up, he kind of lived by that. And here's what some people said about him. Foote was the personal embodiment of the period that embraced the origin, the progress, and the close of the most thrilling drama in modern years. So, Foote was in there involved in politics all the way from the Jacksonian period to Reconstruction, when there was a lot of stuff going on. And Reuben Davis got along with him really well, and Reuben Davis eventually produced a book, and there's a lot of funny stories about Foote in the book. Then there were other people that looked at him in various ways. Foote was a thoroughly aggressive politician who possessed a fiery and vehement temper. Somebody said that about him. Erratic genius. That was kind of typical. Anybody that called him a genius, they always had to qualify it with something, So he was an erratic genius, and then a lot of people hated him. A thoroughly abhorred and despised politician, a self-deflating bag of gas. Those are all quotes about Foote. Foote, he's in Virginia, born in Virginia into what we would consider a middle-class kind of family. Studies law, moves to Alabama just when Alabama is opening up. Alabama had been a state, 5 or 6 years maybe when Foote got there. He knows he wants to be involved in politics, so he opens a law practice, starts a newspaper where he can pontificate on all these different political issues. And, of course, that's when he gets involved in his first duel with this guy. Here, Edmund Winston, who was the member of a political family there in North Alabama, who was they had gotten there before Foote, and they were prominent, and Foote resented it. And he printed some stuff in the newspaper about Edmund Winston that the Winston family didn't like. It was a big family of politicians anyway. So they jumped him one day on the street, him and a couple of his buddies. The Winstons jumped the Foote and his friends, and there was a brawl, and they ended up being a challenge, and they had a duel Winston and Foote. And Foote was notoriously a terrible shot, so this is one of the few times that he wounded anybody. But he wounds Winston, and unfortunately for Foote, there was a dueling law there in Alabama that said one of the punishments, if you were a lawyer, you're going to be disbarred, of course, if you were convicted of dueling. And the Winston family, Foote's opponent there, they had more political connections than Foote at the time, so they were able to get him prosecuted. And he's disbarred in Alabama, so he's got to go somewhere else. So he leaves Alabama because he can't practice law for 5 years, decides to head for New Orleans, stops in Natchez, thinks, hey, Natchez, this might be a place where I can get a foothold here. I might do better here than in New Orleans, which was already kind of crowded with people. Natchez, of course, as you probably all know, an early cultural center there on the Mississippi River. I gave a version of this talk just the other day at the Jimmy Carter Museum, and so it's all Georgians that were there, so I had to make sure they knew Natchez was founded 2 years before New Orleans, because I told them it's in all the brochures down there. But anyway, so Natchez, a lot of stuff going on, obviously, in Natchez. He ends up moving back closer to Jackson, and he resides in Clinton for a long time. That gives him access to Natchez, Vicksburg, and Jackson, the seat of government. And he tries a lot of cases, becomes involved in Jacksonian-era politics, and then, of course, he gets in a couple of duels. He's in the courtroom one day, and the opposing lawyer is Sergeant Smith Prentice, who you may have heard of. He's a famous antebellum Mississippi politician. Prentice County is named after him. Well, they get into some kind of scuffle there in the courtroom, start calling one another names. Foote throws an inkwell at Prentice, and Prentice responds and calls him a coward and some other things. And Foote issues a challenge. Foote is wounded, ironically, in the foot during this duel. But that wasn't the end of it. Afterwards, Foote's friends began spreading a lot of rumors about Sergeant Smith Prentice, his conduct on the dueling ground there. And he gets mad, so they got to fight a second duel. They fight a second duel, and he's wounded again. And this one, I can't remember if it was the first one or the second one. Foote limps a little bit for the rest of his life because of the wound. He was wounded in the leg again. So he fights two duels with Sergeant Smith Prentice. Like a lot of other Southern politicians, he's very interested in what's going on out in Texas, the Texas Revolution. A lot of Southerners, of course, are keeping an eye on that. They want Texas to break away from Mexico. Long term, they see annexation and the spread of the Cotton Kingdom out west. So Foote goes around and raising money for the Texas Revolution. And a lot of Mississippians go out there and actually fight in the Texas Revolution. So he's heavily involved with that. And then once the revolution takes place, he actually decides he's going to relocate to Texas. He keeps his house here in Mississippi, but he goes out to Texas because, again, Texas is all kinds of turmoil, going on. And Foote sees a situation where he might be able to kind of worm his way up in the political system there in Texas, the Republic of Texas at this point. And, of course, he makes the wrong move. He gets involved in a rivalry between these two guys here, Sam Houston and Mirabeau Lamar, which I don't know if you see it or not, but this guy always looked like Mickey Gilley to me. Did you ever remember Mickey Gilley? Okay. Am I imagining that? Okay, I see it this big on the screen now. He really looks like Mickey Gilley. Anyway, Foote gets involved in this power struggle between these two guys. And Sam Houston was the first president of the Republic of Texas. He was term limited, so he couldn't go for a second term. And Lamar wins the presidency for the second term. And now it's time for the third term, and these two guys are going to oppose one another. And that's the power struggle, is between the faction loyal to Houston and the one loyal to Lamar. Foote sides with the Lamar faction, starts writing all these letters to newspapers and things that are critical of Sam Houston, Foote, again, a prodigious writer, even writes his own history of Texas while he's out there. He produces a 400-page document in 8 months, which I wish I could do that. And it's highly critical of Houston, and it's meant to build, it's completely biased, but it's meant to build Lamar up and to tear Houston down a little bit. And you had to be kind of careful about how you attacked Houston, because he's the big war hero over there in Texas. Anyway, Houston wins out. So now the Lamar faction is out of power. There were even rumors that if Lamar had become president of Houston, of Texas, Foote might be considered for a cabinet post, maybe even Secretary of State. But none of that happens. So Foote sells his property, comes back to Mississippi, does get involved in the annexation movement like many loyal Democrats of the period, the Southern Democrats. They were, again, always eyeing what was going on there in Texas. Gets involved with that and helps push for that. But he starts practicing law again and again gets more and more heavily involved in politics here in the state. And although every speech he gives, he usually says, now I'm here, I'm not seeking any political office, I'm just here to talk about issues. Well, he's looking for political office. It's every speech he's given. And it's time for another duel. Got into a duel with Osmond Claiborne, who was a member of the famous Claiborne family. If you know Mississippi history, the Claibornes are all involved there, Mississippi and Louisiana. And I looked and I could not find the exact cause of this, but I just will speculate that Henry Foote insulted the guy. And they ended up fighting that duel in Columbus. I don't know why they fought it in Columbus other than Mississippi had anti-dueling laws too, and I think they wanted to fight somewhere that wasn't around the state capitol, that might be somewhat removed from the state capitol. Anyway, Foote did wound Claiborne here. It's amazing nobody ever got killed in one of these duels Foote was involved in. Then he's going to become a U.S. Senator in 1847, and he doesn't get elected in a standard way here. There were several candidates, and this was an era when the legislatures sent the U.S. senators up. And there were several candidates for the Senate seat that was open. One was John A. Quitman, who you probably heard of. It's always good to talk to Mississippi people. They know all the references. You don't have to explain anything. Well, Quitman was running, but Quitman apparently was not a very good public speaker. A lot of people didn't think he was. So Foote was engaged, was sort of hired to go speak and give speeches on Quitman's behalf all over the state. Well, Foote did that, and he had this strong personality, and he was so good at public speaking, he ends up winning the people over, and suddenly he becomes a candidate, and he gets enough support in the legislature, he becomes the U.S. Senator. So he's sent up there, he kind of steals the seat from Quitman, who again Quitman himself, as you may know, is an interesting character. And it's this period here when he gets in the fight with Jefferson Davis. Most people think that the hatred between Foote and Davis, the origins, was about, 1847, probably about 6 years before this. Jefferson Davis's brother-in-law was involved in a duel, and the brother-in-law was killed. And the guy that killed him was prosecuted, and Foote was the lawyer and got him acquitted. So a lot of people think that's where the genesis of the Foote-Davis feud. But Davis, is the other U.S. senator at this point. So these are the two U.S. senators. They don't like each other, and both of them want to be the primary spokesman for Mississippi. So there's a rivalry there. Davis, all his life, tried to ignore Foote. There's a couple of letters out there where Davis said something about Foote. He tried his best to ignore Foote, and Foote was just the opposite. He would criticize Davis all the time. Even in the 1870s, after the Civil War, after all that had run its course, Foote was still writing letters to the New York Times talking about how horrible Jefferson Davis was. So so they hated one another. And, of course, the higher Davis rose in the National Democratic Party, the more jealous Foote got of him. And like I said a while ago, the Compromise of 1850, Foote was kind of in the right place at the right time. There was a lot of Southern politicians were against what became the Compromise of 1850. They didn't like the compromise. The entire Mississippi congressional delegation was sent a letter by the state legislature and by the governor at the time telling them to vote against the compromise. And Foote decided to ignore that. So he becomes one of the leading Southern spokesmen for this, what they called at the time, pro-union position. Just like it says right there. And he did just what I said, see? He's right there on the slide. Anyway, so there's a lot of political pressure for him not to negotiate with the Northerners and not to accept the compromise that many of these Northerners, including Henry Clay, of course, were pushing, And he completely ignores the edicts from the governor and the legislature. Or then he gets in another fight. A lot of when these negotiations were going on there on the floor of the Senate, I mean, it was very heated. A lot of harsh words were spoken. And, of course, Foote was really good at speaking harsh words. And this guy here, Solon Borland, he was a U.S. Senator from Arkansas. And he's walking down the street in Washington, D.C. one day, and he meets Foote. And Borland starts insulting Foote. And Foote doesn't like it. And Borland ends up hitting Foote and almost injuring him. He hurt him scratched him up pretty well. And then some bystanders pull them apart. But two U.S. senators, I mean, could you imagine the media frenzy that would, and Foote did this kind of stuff about every 6 months, pulled a pistol on Thomas Hart Benton on the floor of the U.S. Senate while he was senator. This is a very, very famous, if you read histories of the United States Senate, this is a famous incident. They always talk about this, and it was covered in all the newspapers. It's very dramatic. Foote is insulting Thomas Hart Benton, who was kind of a crusty character as well. And finally, Benton tried to ignore him, and he can't take it anymore, and he starts moving. He gets up, and he starts moving toward Foote, at which time Foote pulls out this pistol. He points it at Benton. Benton stops. He rips open his shirt and his coat, and he says, "Let the assassin fire. Let the assassin fire." And both of them are sitting there waiting, for their buddies to stop the thing. So it's a big scene, it's a big scene. Again, the ratings for C-SPAN would skyrocket if there was back. These guys today, they're just boring compared to these guys back then. Anyway, what else did he do while he was in the Senate? He threatens John P. Hale, a New Hampshire senator, threatens to kill him. Says, "I'm going to hang you from a sour apple tree," which was an expression. I think Andrew Jackson said that same thing about John C. Calhoun at one point. And they stick him, Hale and his buddies stick Foote with the name Hangman Foote, and that nickname stays with him for a good 10 years. Let's see, more fights. Gets in a fist fight in the cloakroom with Senator John C. Fremont, who just a couple of years later will become the first Republican candidate for president when the Republican Party is formed. And Fremont is Thomas Hart Benton's son-in-law, so there was some residual hatred there. But they get in a fist fight as well. Anyway, Foote, though, he argues for the compromise, and in the face of tremendous political pressure to do otherwise, he never wavers. He says, we've got to have this compromise, and he tries to characterize the people that are against the compromise, like Jefferson Davis and others. He calls them secessionists, calls them radicals, says they're only out to promote an agenda that will enrich them. A lot of insults toward the opposite side there. And of course the opposite side was hurling insults toward Foote. But the point is he never wavered off that position, even though there was a lot of pressure for him to do so. He's eventually censured by the Mississippi State Legislature because he goes along with the compromise. And since the legislature sends the U.S. senators up to Washington at this point, if you're censured by the legislature, your chances for being reelected are pretty slim. And he knew that, so he resigns his Senate seat before they could kick him out. Then he goes and decides to run for governor. They have a governor's race. And again, it's 1851. It's only a year removed from all the hoopla surrounding the compromise. And there's still, the two sides in this election are still the sort of the pro-union side and the other side, which saw secession as a decent option to what was going on with regard to the slavery issue. And again, it's 10 years before the Civil War. So Foote knew, he went back to Mississippi to campaign for governor, and he knew that the state politicians from Mississippi and a lot of the other southern states, they were a little bit more at this point radical as far as pushing secession than the average voter might be. You know, the politicians at that point, they had to kind of take these extreme stands, and whereas the general public was more moderate. You know, they hadn't quite been worked up into a frenzy. They weren't getting into fights like this, like they were on the floor of the U.S. Senate, not yet anyway. So Foote frames himself as a pro-union guy that wants to keep Mississippi safe within the Union, and that's the best course to go, and you don't want to go with any of these other guys that might promote secession to take Mississippi out of the Union and it'd be harmful and so on and so forth. Quitman there's Quitman again. John A. Quitman, he is the candidate, Quitman is a pro-secession guy. And Quitman and Foote are the candidates in the election, and they do this series of debates where they appear jointly. And it doesn't take till about the third one, Foote goads Quitman into attacking him on the stage. So Quitman attacks Foote on the stage. They get in a fist fight right there on the stage, right in front of everybody. The crowd's going wild, cheering, hey, I'm glad I didn't miss this, you know, all that kind of thing. And Quitman quits the race. It's a little more complicated than that, but Quitman ended up quitting the race. So the mainstream Democrats, they need somebody to run, and they talked to Jefferson Davis, who really didn't want to run. They talked him into running. And this is great for Foote. Foote can't wait to beat Davis, and he does. But he only beats him by about 1,000 votes. And if Davis had had more time to campaign, Davis became the candidate sort of at the end of the election cycle. Davis might have beaten him. But what's happened, though, Foote gets elected, but by this time he's burned a bridge with Davis, certainly, arguably the most important Mississippi politician of that period. Same with Quitman. Burned bridges with or about 2/3 of the state legislature. And again, it leads him to be just not a very good governor. Very ineffective, because the whole legislature is against him. And again, most of the other political voices that have any kind of juice there in the state, they're against him. So he serves for a couple of years, and then he decides to resign and go elsewhere. He kind of gets mad. And he leaves. He goes out to California, of all places, which, of course, California is just opening up. Gets involved in something called the Know Nothing movement, which was a movement during this period. It was an anti-immigrant, that was the main foundation of the party. Out in California, it was a little different from the national Know Nothing party. In California, it was sort of just an opposition party to the Democratic Party that was already trying to get its hooks into California. Anyway, he runs for Senate, and he misses election by 1 vote. So he almost gets elected U.S. Senator from California. So he gets mad and he leaves there. He goes to Tennessee, comes back to the South, Tennessee, where he's still well known. He's still a name. Everybody knew who he was. And he preaches, pro-union. He sticks to the script there with his pro-union activities up until the very end when Tennessee secedes. And then, of course, he says, I knew all the time this secession was a good idea. And I'd like to announce my candidacy for the Confederate Congress. And he gets elected to the Confederate Congress. He lives in Nashville, so he represents that Middle Tennessee area. Some people believe he wanted to get elected to the Confederate Congress just so he could attack Jefferson Davis, who was president of the Confederacy. Some people think that was his sole motivation, which he does. Here's some things that Foote said on the floor of the Congress, on the floor of the House. I am thoroughly satisfied that Mr. Davis and his associates are bent on establishing a despotism. I resolve in the most open manner to denounce the conspirators against the freedom of my fellow citizens of the South. Davis's tyranny is the sole cause of all the calamities which have befallen the country. Called Davis a fiendish character, responsible for more barefaced acts of corruption than any single individual has ever been known to commit in the same space and time in any part of Christendom. And this is not in a private letter. This is public statement, okay, on the floor of the Confederate Congress. Or he gets in another fight. Edmund S. Dargan, who's a buddy of Davis's, he's critical of Foote, and they have words, and both men pull out knives. They're on the floor of the Confederate Congress, and they have to be separated. There's fight after fight after fight. Richmond, Rouse Pollard, he's a famous editor, newspaper editor in Richmond, Virginia. He's kind of a big deal in newspaper circles. Foote gets in a fight with him, and Pollard almost beats Foote unconscious with an umbrella, of all things. He's finally censured by the Confederate Congress because of his conduct, and there are other reasons too. And then he kind of goes haywire. He decides that if he's not haywire already, he decides that he and himself alone, he's going to leave the Confederacy, go up to Washington, D.C., talk to the Lincoln administration, and try to broker a peace agreement between the North, the United States government there, and the Confederacy. And this is about 1865. And a lot of people speculate, and it's a pretty easy line to draw. You know, the war's winding down. The Confederacy, it's obviously they're going to lose, and he's trying to set himself up for something after the war. So he's going to try to go cozy up with the Lincoln administration. It doesn't work. The Lincoln administration, he did get to talk to William Seward, Secretary of State, but they think he's kind of nutty. They send him back first to the Confederacy. He goes back, then he's given the choice of going back to the Confederacy or leaving the country. He goes to Canada, lives there briefly, starts working on his personal memoir with the ominous title Casket of Reminiscences. And in that memoir, it's a very good record of stuff that was going on during that period. It's also filled with, he praises his friends and just insults his enemies, and you can tell it's pretty obvious that he's wanting to get a pound of flesh there. He also writes his own history of the Civil War era, where he charts a course that makes his friends look good. And about half of that book is about Jefferson Davis and how horrible Davis is. During this period, a lot of the Southern leaders right after the war started writing these books because they wanted to get their side of the story out, because if you're on the losing side, you don't want to get blamed for it. So they write, and a lot of these memoirs to blame this one or blame that one. I mean, a lot of them are sort of biased one way or the other, but Foote's is especially biased there. Then he decides to become a Republican in Tennessee, and he's fairly effective speaking for the Republican Party in Tennessee during that Reconstruction era before the Republican Party begins to wane there. And he ends up being appointed director of the New Orleans Mint. It's an appointed position, so they kind of give him that as a reward for campaigning in Tennessee and to kind of get him out of the way. And he loved being the head of the Mint down there. All he did all day really was just sit around, and he was great. Reporters loved him because he would say all these wild things. He was good for wild quotes in the newspaper, so he'd pontificate just on this and that, and he just, mainly what he did. They'd ask him how he liked New Orleans. He said, "I love New Orleans. I love working for the Mint. New Orleans is a great place to make money," is what he used. That was his line, big line that he used. Finally dies in 1880. And his obituary is carried in most of the major newspapers. I mean, he was a figure that a lot of people knew about. And of course, when somebody passes away, usually they don't get treated quite as harshly. And these were a couple of more positive obits. Taken all in all, he was the most extraordinary character the South has produced since the death of John Randolph of Roanoke. So again, extraordinary character, though, not necessarily complimentary, but that's what at least they didn't call him in the SOB or something, you know. And the Jackson paper here, Foote was, quote, talented, brilliant, and in some respects, as genius often is, eccentric. Again, genius, but it must be qualified by something. Well, they say if you're crazy and you got a lot of money, you're eccentric, isn't that what they say? He was impulsive and never counted the cost or consequence of the steps he deemed proper to take. And then, a lot of papers were not that forgiving. Foote was, quote, a short, pompous old man full of vanity in words and boastful of his somewhat romantic career. And then the St. Louis paper said he was a droll personage, an odd mixture of virtues and defects. He went through his life exuberant with vanity and full of self-delusion. My wife says that about me sometimes. A man of words rather than ideas, all his speeches and writings were remarkable for verbiage and bombast. And that's actually not a bad description of Foote. He was kind of a sort of a mixed bag. Again, he had a lot of talents. He never exercised them and really lived up to his potential. He could have been one of those great statesmen of the era. He hung around with all of them. They all talked to him. He talked to all of them. They talked to him. But again, he was just a little too volatile of a character. He just too restless of a character, and in many respects too violent of a character as well. And that's where the book comes from. So I appreciate you being here. I could take some questions. Yes, sir. Thanks.
I'd like to know if where he lived in Clinton and for about how long.
I don't know exactly where. There's one picture that exists that is supposed to be of his house, but the picture, you can't tell where it is. He lived in Clinton, probably, at least for a decade. So he lived there for quite a long time. But I don't know the exact precisely where he lived. The house that's in the picture was torn down, I think, in the 40s. So there's no trace of it anywhere. So I'm not sure about that.
I guess one question I've been thinking about, is there any connection with this Foote and the town of Foote, Mississippi at the north end of Lake Washington, and Shelby Foote, the author?
Everybody always asks about Shelby Foote. He is distantly related, according to Shelby Foote, he's distantly related to Henry Foote. That's all I know. I found a thing I didn't do the complete genealogy, but Shelby Foote in one of his books talks about Henry Foote, and he says that he's distant kin. So if there is a connection, it's distant. No idea.
What was his relationship, if any, with William Sharkey, who was appointed governor by the Reconstruction regime?
He was a political ally of Sharkey. In fact, Sharkey could have had a slide of him up here. He helped Sharkey's brother get out of some legal trouble at one point early on, and they became friends after that. So Sharkey was a pro-Union, a Whig, and he and Foote were pretty close allies for most of this period where they were active.
Where specifically did he live in North Alabama?
Tuscumbia. And he was one of the original trustees of what became University of North Alabama, up in that area. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, he was a lawyer, right? I'm wondering where did he get his money? He traveled so much. Where did the money come from?
That's a good question. I wondered that myself as I was looking. He was involved in all kinds of land speculation. He owned land in about probably 12 or 14 counties in Mississippi, bought and sold land through political operatives. Again, he rubbed elbows with a lot of important people, so he had a lot of opportunities to make money off of his politics. Hard to believe somebody do that, but anyway, so he kind of made it the standard way some politicians make money, I guess. But he knew a lot of important people, and he got a lot of opportunities there. But he was kind of it was feast or famine. Sometimes he was pretty flush, sometimes he had a lot of money, and then sometimes he had to quit traveling around and practice law, for about 6 months or a year to get his cash situation in better shape.
Mr. Wynne, I have to ask you this because my wife is a descendant of Senator Henry Clay. Mm-hmm. Did Mr. Foote ever meet Senator Clay?
Yeah, they met constantly during the talks about the Compromise of 1850, because Clay was the lead point man on that initially, the compromise efforts there. Clay of Kentucky, and Foote, they corresponded and met, and he knew all of the guys that were up there during that period, Clay and Calhoun and the whole bunch.
Did he have any family with all his moving around, like wife, children?
He did have a family. He had people always ask that too. He had 7 children, so he was not working, all the time. And they all, most of them, were coming of age when he moved out to California. And most of them stayed out in California. One of the daughters married a guy that was U.S. Senator that gets elected to the U.S. Senate representing Nevada. One of his son-in-laws marries another one of his daughters, ends up being the mayor of Oakland, California. So they married into these political families out there. And I don't know, one of the children died when he was in his 20s, so he died prematurely. And I think most of those children, there's one of them that came back and was in Nashville for a while, but most of those children, I think they stayed out west because their father generated so much controversy in the east. But then he had a short marriage toward the end of his life. His first wife died, and he remarried, and he was married to another woman while he was living in Nashville.
I might have missed this because I was out from some of the time that some of the time that you spoke, so I might have missed it. But I'll ask. I'm wondering. I know that Jefferson Davis had very strong feelings about slavery, and I'm wondering if this guy Foote, what was his feelings about slavery, and if that might have had anything to do with the difficulties between himself and Jefferson Davis over slavery, because slavery was quite a controversial topic at the time,
right,
even though many people had slaves in Mississippi. So I was wondering if that had anything to do with the conflict between the two of them.
Did not have anything to do with it because Foote's feelings on slavery were the same as Davis's. Even the pro-union, all the pro-union Southern politicians of this period, they didn't mean they were anti-slavery. He was a strong pro-slavery guy, just like Davis. So none of that didn't have anything to do with it. It was more of a personal kind of thing. But Foote, he was definitely a pro-slavery advocate, just like Davis and a lot of the others, all the others.
Professor Wynne, and I've always wanted to say that.
God bless you. My fraternity
brothers. So did Foote have a consistent political ideology, or was he just a political operative that constantly changed with where the wind was blowing?
He was both. He stuck to his guns on the being an anti-secessionist for about 12 years. Again, he was under a lot of pressure not to accept that compromise of 1850, and he did it anyway, and he lost his Senate seat. So he was principled. I'd say he was heavily principled for 12 years. And in the other years, I don't know, you make a case either way. But he was definitely also an opportunist, a bombastic guy. Definitely was, he was not pure, if that's what you're asking. That's that Millsap's education, see.
With all his travels and his good and bad maybe stops, is there any one place that maybe claims him or distances themselves from him?
Well, I hadn't seen any billboards out in Clinton, if that's what you mean. I don't. Well, he's always mentioned in all the books that are written, the Mississippi history books. They always mention Foote, and people write books about the Mississippi governors. He's always mentioned there. He's got his picture over in the new Capitol. So I mean, he's claimed, but not acknowledged, overly acknowledged, let's say. But none of the other, like Tennessee, California, Alabama, he's not really well known out there.
Did Foote foresee the economic calamity that would come to Mississippi from disunion, and what were his arguments for union?
His arguments for a union, there was an economic argument that he made. If the South secedes, it's going to be, the South would be on terrible economic footing. A lot of his arguments, pro-union arguments, were mainly bombast against the secessionists and what they were up to. And he would try to paint a picture of, well, imagine the South secedes. You lose all the economic benefit from the major ports like New York, Philadelphia. The United States would then become an enemy. Then what happens with the British or the French? Would they come in and try to force their will on this new, and obviously it was going to be a weaker country that would have formed. He, like most of those unions, made an economic argument because they figured that economic argument would resonate better than any other argument, because you talk about people's pocketbook, they're going to listen to you. He talked about that a lot, and just tried to paint the secessionists as these shady characters that were out to do something nefarious that was going to just line their own pockets. How was that answer? Is that okay? Decent? Okay. I was trying. I think there was one over here that, somebody had their hand up over here? Maybe I missed that. I don't know. Oh, okay.
He hated Jeff Davis so much. Did he call for his hanging, for treason?
Actually, he called for his imprisonment. I don't think he called for his hanging, but he, after the war, he was very harsh on Davis, thought he ought to be in prison and so on and so forth. I don't think he went as far as, I can't remember reading anything about him wanting to hang him from a sour apple tree, but that was certainly the sentiment, though.
Can you tell just a few details about the proposed thing in 1850, the compromise?
Well, the compromise ended up, a lot of things were happening. The main reason you needed a compromise, because the Mexican War had ended in 1850. I can tell you, I could give you a 3-hour thing on it, but the nutshell was the Mexican War ended in 1848. The United States annexes a lot of Western territory, a whole lot of territory. Then the question becomes, is slavery going to spread into that territory? So that opens up the debate in a big way. They end up making a compromise. There are other issues in play, the status of slavery in Washington, D.C., how strong the fugitive slave law is going to be, if there's going to be a new, stronger fugitive slave law, which the Southerners were pushing for. So they make the compromise. California came in as a free state. The rest of that territory, there was no restriction placed on slavery. The slave trade, but not slavery itself, was outlawed in D.C., and then a stronger fugitive slave law also came out of that. But there were a lot of Southerners who didn't want to compromise at all. They wanted slavery protected everywhere. So a lot of Southern politicians were against the compromise.
Sir, what inspired his move from Virginia down this direction?
Because he gets to Alabama, I think it's 1825, if I remember correctly. That's 6 years after Alabama becomes a state. Wide open. They don't even have the rule of law, nailed down yet. So in Virginia, an established locale where there's, hundreds of lawyers. But in Alabama, there's not. And plus there's a lot of legal work just on land titles alone. When you become a state and there's all these weird land titles, people have been claiming this land here and that land here, and they don't really own it. And a lot of people getting in duels, they get in these jams they got to be helped out of. So there was a lot of work down there, and that was kind of his M.O. He went to Alabama when Alabama was wide open. Then he's headed for New Orleans, and New Orleans is too crowded, and he stops in Natchez, which, is a lot of things going on there, but it wasn't as big as New Orleans. It was a little more wide open as far as getting business. And then he tries out to go out to Texas, which is wide open, California. He's always looking for new starts because he always burns the bridges before the last place he was.
Ben, was he as combative in the Confederate Congress as he was in the United States Senate, and who were his allies in the Confederate Congress?
He didn't have many allies in the Confederate Congress. He wore out his welcome pretty quickly. Okay. In the U.S. Congress, he had allies. Most of them were on the enemy of my enemy is my friend basis, those kinds of alliances. In the Confederate Congress, because he was just, it started, not to go into great detail, but after the Fort Donelson, after that happened, Foote started blaming Davis for that. And so that happened early on, So he was just so outspoken against Davis that people got tired of him pretty quick in the Congress. So we had some people that he amused mildly who didn't like Davis also, but you just couldn't deal with him. Once he left that path he was on as a pro-union guy, that did ground him. But once he got in the Confederate Congress, he had not been a secessionist, hadn't been palling around with all the secessionists, didn't have the network there, and it just kind of died on the vine.
Did he get involved in Reconstruction at all, or come back to Mississippi during that period of time and try to profit from that in any way?
Not in Mississippi. He was involved in Tennessee. He came back and settled back in Nashville, and that's how he was able to get the appointment to the New Orleans Mint. That's a federal appointment. He gave speeches for the Republican Party in Tennessee. Last time he was in Mississippi, it was some kind of business convention over in Vicksburg, but it was a thing that was sponsored by the Republican Party. So there were a lot of people in Mississippi by that time. They didn't like him.
We've made it to the top of another hour. Thank you all for coming. We have copies of the book for sale.
Thank you.
Help me thank Ben Wynne for this program.